We have this belief, and it runs deep, that effort equals results. You put in the work, you'll get the outcome. And for some things, that's true. But there are people out there trying twice as hard as everyone else and getting half the credit. And the problem isn't them, and never was. In this episode, we'll talk about why trying harder isn't always the fix that leads to success. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Think Differently. I have been pondering something lately, and it's one of those things that the more you think about it and notice it, the harder it becomes to unsee. It's this idea that if something isn't working, the answer must be to try harder. And I don't think we even realize how deeply ingrained that is in our culture or our mindset and all of us. It shows up everywhere. In school, they tell you, well, if you just applied yourself. At work, it's you just need to be more disciplined, work harder. And even internally, sometimes you'll catch yourself thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just get this done? Why can't I focus and push through? And I'll be honest, maybe that's a true statement sometimes. For a long time, I believed that if you just worked harder, things would work out. And for certain things, that is true. You put in the extra effort, you put in the extra practice, and it pays off. But then there's other things. And it doesn't matter how hard I tried, it just didn't translate into results. It translated into work, it translated into effort, and yes, there were outcomes and productivity, and it was positive. But you weren't realizing the reward. You weren't being recognized, and you couldn't figure out why. And I remember thinking back years ago, sitting at a desk, knowing exactly what I needed to do. I could play the whole day out before it even started, crystal clear. I could explain my job, I could map it out, I could help somebody else do it, I could teach it. But when it came time to actually start my own work, to put pen to paper, it was like nothing, like no inertia at all. And it wasn't laziness. It actually felt like an internal friction, like trying to push something forward that you knew was movable, but for whatever reason just wouldn't move at that moment. And the more I tried to push through, the worse it got. And when those things happen, outsiders, this is when they say you lack motivation, you're not being persistent, you're not putting in the effort, you lack focus, you're not trying hard enough. But when you're in that experience, when you're living it, nobody really appreciates that you're completely aware of the problem. They don't see the internal resistance. They don't see the mental back and forth. They don't see how you're already beating yourself up. They don't see the energy it's taking to sit there and try to force effort in an area where it just isn't coming. What they do see is the outcome. No activity or lots of frantic activity. It's not done, or it's late, or it just made it under the wire. And then comes the labels. You're procrastinating. You're always waiting to the last minute. And the conclusion becomes, you're not trying hard enough. Now, for my neurodivergent friends listening, especially those with ADHD, you already know what I'm talking about. This is your life, probably every day. Because people with ADHD, some people on the autism spectrum, and then people with different executive functioning profiles, this is a very familiar tale. And these are not people who lack capability or skills or intelligence. If anything, these are individuals that actually have some profoundly remarkable talents. But we think differently. We solve problems differently. We can be creative. We absolutely can do the work in front of us. But sometimes the work just isn't engaging enough in that moment. And that might actually be the real problem. We see connections that other people miss. So sometimes it's hard to push through rote tasks that we understand need to be done, but just don't really matter in the big scheme of things. And so performance doesn't look consistent because if it's too easy and too boring, we're not engaged. And if it feels too hard or the task feels insurmountable, we don't want to fail, so we don't start, hence the procrastination. And that inconsistency, overproducer one week, underproducer the next, done in an hour, but it took 10 days to begin, that's when you get labeled inconsistent, problematic. You can be incredibly bright and still not be doing well in school. You could see patterns and learn things quickly, break down complex ideas, explain things in ways that make people rethink how they know things themselves. And in that same breath, you're struggling to get your work in on time, or you're half engaged in class. And we see this in neurodivergent gifted populations all the time. And so what happens when people look at that from the outside? Well, going back to, it's that assumption there's a lack of effort, that lack of motivation, or worse, a lack of drive or goals. There's this fallacy that if you're capable, you perform consistently. And if you're not performing consistently, something must be wrong with you. But here's what some people don't understand, especially when we're talking about variance in neurological wiring. It might not actually be the task that's hard. It might be the starting of the task, just making that first step. And often once we get people started, once they're in the task and have found movement and momentum, they're usually fine. They'll get into a flow and get it done. That's the procrastination pattern, right? They wait and they wait and they wait and they stew, and then suddenly there's 1 hour left and the pressure valve releases and they get it done. And somebody looks at that and says, if you could have done it in an hour, why did you waste 3 days trying to get it started? But the truth is there was a mental block, something that wouldn't move, something we can't fully describe, but very intense to time pressure. And it's exactly what it takes sometimes to release so that the brain can actually function. It's a little different than you would think, that more time pressure actually helps the brain produce. For ADHD specifically, the challenge is almost never a lack of understanding of the work. It's initiation, the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. And that gap is real. And it doesn't close just because someone tells you to sit down and work on it. If anything, forcing the sit down and just work on it actually can make the block worse because now you're laying pressure on top of something that's already not moving. And then for folks on autism spectrum, we often see that the capability is very strong, but any sort of ambiguity becomes the barrier. Unclear expectations, unwritten rules, shifting priorities that nobody's naming out loud. And if that person has a high sense of justice that things should be clearer than they are, well, now we have resistance on top of confusion, on top of procrastination. So again, it's not that the person can't do the work, but it's the environment isn't structured in a way that allows their brain to open up, to flow, and ultimately succeed. And this is where I think we need to shift the conversation. Because in these conversations, we spend so much time on the individual. What's wrong with them? What's not working? Why are they doing it this way? Why can't they just follow through? And we spend almost no time looking at how the work itself is structured and what we're actually asking people to do. In education, gifted students opt out all the time. And a big reason is that a lot of so-called gifted coursework isn't actually accelerated learning, it's accelerated pace. It's actually the same work, just more of it faster. That's not allowing for leaps in knowledge, that's pushing a grind. And that grind breaks people down. Workplaces are the same. There's an expected pace, an expected communication style, the way we organize and prioritize work around here. And if you naturally align with those and can easily adapt, it feels relatively smooth. Trying harder works. Working hard gets it done faster. But if you don't align to those things, then trying harder just means you're working against yourself and you're causing the pressure, which causes the stall. And over time, that actually creates something deeper. It creates a narrative inside the individual that is not only unfair, but often untrue. Because when effort doesn't produce results in the speed or timeline or pattern people expect, people don't question the system. They doubt the person. And the person starts to believe, maybe I'm not disciplined enough. Maybe I'm not capable. Maybe I'm not motivated. When in reality, they've just been trying to work in a way that doesn't work for them. I see this in organizations all the time. There's that one person that everybody goes to when something breaks, when they can't figure something out, when they need that fresh perspective. The person that can solve any problem quickly, sees things nobody else sees coming. And at the same time, they're procrastinating, struggling with deadlines, they need more reminders, and they don't always follow the expected process. And because of that, the narrative around them shifts. Oh, they're so smart, but they're inconsistent. They're unreliable. But if you really look at it, the issue was never the skills or the capability. It's systems alignment. We are very comfortable mistaking friction, that dissonance between how someone works and how the system expects them to work, for a lack of effort. When something doesn't move the way we want it to, we assume that person isn't trying hard enough. Instead of asking whether something about the process, the request, or the system is creating the resistance. Because if someone is trying twice as hard to get the same result, and it's not a skill issue, and it's not a knowledge issue, then it's probably actually not the performance issue you think it is. It's an alignment problem. So maybe the shift isn't telling people to try harder or to fit in, or to work the way everyone else does. Maybe it's about asking better questions. We should be asking, is the request actually clear? Are we asking people to do things that feel redundant or don't have obvious value? What about this timeline is adding uncertainty or unnecessary pressure? What part of this process is creating friction? And what would happen if we just talked about adjusting the structure, or how the deliverables are conveyed, or the deadline structured, instead of just pushing the person to comply because we said so? Because while the goal is never to lower expectations, the goal should be to make an effort that leads to actual relevant results. Completing a report isn't a result if the report has no value the day after it's created. Yes, you got the work done, but does it matter? We have to be willing to ask, are we doing this because it needs to be done, or because we've always done it this way? And when we're willing to sit with that question, honestly, something great happens. People start talking about the work, about better ways to approach it, about how to actually prove competency and meet objectives. And people don't have to mask anymore. They don't have to pretend that it's working. They don't have to force themselves into ways of being that are causing distress when there are better ways to get there. So if you're in a place where you feel like you're trying harder than everyone else and not getting the same results, but you know you're just as capable, you know you have the skills, it's probably not a lack of effort. It's not about your intelligence. It might just be you're out of alignment. It might be that the system wasn't designed for your brain and mind. And if you're leading others, the question should never be, why aren't they working harder? It should be, what would help this work better? Or be even bolder and ask the question, what am I missing here? Because if you have a bright person who's underperforming, they didn't magically lose their skills. They're still the capable person you hired. So you need to stop and ask yourself, what changed? And what could I change so this person can excel again? Because as I always say, different does not mean deficient. It means innovation, new processes, methods, new approaches. And sometimes the problem isn't how hard someone is trying. Sometimes it's just they've been trying in ways that were never designed for them to succeed in the first place. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.